before I became a cynical, angry young man at the age of 12 and dismissed the whole season as a gross consumerist farce, I used to love Christmas. And though I still see it that way, really, I don't send cards or presents or ritually overeat with family on the 25th, yet I look back upon those childhood days with a kind of fond nostalgia. I think there's something pure about any love, after all. And there was such a naive enthusiasm with which I awaited the arrival of the tree, and the way I would shrewdly assess what lay beneath the glaring wrapping paper of the presents with my name on it, nestled under the branches. And the sadness with which I would see the Christmas lights come down from the windows in my street in the first days of January. Probably when I have kids, I'll go through the whole thing just to see the look on their faces. But there was one thing I especially loved about Christmas, and that was those little glass balls that you had. I think they're called snow globes, with a castle inside or some absurd depiction of Santa Claus on a sleigh. And you'd shake them and then watch as the snowflakes came tumbling down in the palm of your hand. It might not seem like the most obvious thing for a kid to be excited about, but really, once I got tired of my other presents and I'd eaten enough sickly sweet Christmas food, it was always the snow globes I returned to. Shake them and watch the snow land, and as the last flake arrived, I'd do it all over again. Maybe the snow held some attraction because I grew up in the south of England, where to wake up and find the world turned white was a rare pleasure. And on the few occasions it did snow, it wasn't deep enough for snowmen, just for a snowball fight or to sledge down the hills in the parks. Or maybe it goes deeper than that. I think to be a kid is to be fundamentally powerless. Somebody else decides when you wake up, when you go to bed, what you wear, where you go, what you eat. And other children fought against this tyranny by pretending they were omnipotent superheroes or wizards or witches. But for me, it was enough to hold a world in the palm of my hand. Shake! I could change the weather. If somebody had asked me in that moment, the tired old question of what I wanted to be when I grew up, I think I would have said, God. I was 10 when it happened. I was walking with my parents on the New Year's Day second-hand market near the train station. And I was in good spirits. It was a beautiful, crisp, bright blue day. My parents weren't feeling so good. They were feeling quite hungover, I guess, and wish they had the sense to stop drinking at midnight the night before. But I was going along in fine spirits because I had £10 in my pocket, courtesy of my grandmothers, who every Christmas would send me some garish Christmas card with a stiff £5 note inside. The stalls sold all the second-hand clutter that people found in their garages and attics, and you had to suspect there were probably a few unwanted Christmas presents there too. This being the era when if you wanted to buy something from somebody, you had to actually go and meet them, not like the internet days of eBay and... Yeah, I'm sounding like an old fart already. Anyway, I went along and imagine my joy when I saw a stall with an old blanket across it, covered in snow globes, each of them for £1 each. And I wondered if I might blow my entire savings to get 10 of them. How many gods could say they held 10 worlds in the palm of their hand? Looks like we've got ourselves a real connoisseur here, the stall holder said, sitting up from his deck chair where he had sat with a newspaper under his arm, some rag about horse racing. I nodded indifferently, a bit reluctant to admit I didn't know what the word connoisseur meant. I'm a collector. Is that so? And how much do you have to spend on your collection? £10, I replied proudly, quite innocent of the ways of bargaining still. Well, in that case, we'll have to find you something very special, won't we? And holding my eye, he then shuffled off to the boot of his car, and he returned with something wrapped up in a white cloth. Now listen, there's not many of these left, you understand? If I sell this to you, you have to give me your word as a collector, never to show it to anybody else. You follow? I nodded, feeling in truth a bit intimidated. How much is it? Oh, it's beyond price, but I'll let you have it for a tenner, he said, neatly extracting my £10 from my outstretched fingers. And he slipped the ball into my coat pocket. And not a word to anybody, you remember? Now go on, I'll see you next New Year. And I had to endure the next hour and a half with a burning curiosity to see what lay inside that white cloth, but I was determined to keep the promise I'd made to the man and only look at it when I was alone. So I whined and hassled my parents until finally they were happy enough to go home, which for them meant aspirin and coffee. And it was all I could do not to break into a run as we approached the house. I hurried up the stairs and locked the door behind me and laid out my purchase upon the carpet. And pulling off the cloth, I found an opaque black glass ball. Nothing. I couldn't see anything inside. And with a sinking heart, I realized I had been well and truly cheated. Do you remember the first time you were cheated, tricked, lied to? If you ask me, those are the first tears in the fabric of our innocence, the first cracks in our childhood world, as we realize that we, who have always been loved and adored and cherished, always the center of attention, we realize that there are as many worlds as there are people, and most of them are quite indifferent as to whether it snows in our little glass dome or not. I longed to walk through to my parents' bedroom to tell them what had happened to me, but I knew I'd just get a lecture on the value of money and not listening to strangers, and that was the last thing I wanted right now. So instead, I just sat in my room alone and cried. And that seems to me now to be one of those countless yet vital steps towards growing up. And that's the end of the story. The end of the story, as I wrote it in an essay upon childhood for my English class 5 years later. The teachers praised my honesty and courage, and it even made it into the school magazine. My parents were very proud. And I took in the praise with a sense of humility and empowerment. The power of having tricked the whole world, which is perhaps the second stage towards growing up. Because the story hadn't ended there. Everyone went to bed quite early that night, and I awoke 2 or 3 in the morning, having had a very satisfying dream of throwing mince pies at the man in the market, when I realized something was lighting up my room with a strange white glow. And this was in the days before cell phones and computers did this on a regular basis. And looking under the bed, I saw the glow came from the glass ball that I'd rolled there furiously earlier in the day. I tentatively reached out for it and pulled it out and saw it was glowing bright white, but I couldn't see any place a battery might be. And with all the curiosity of a child, I placed it to my eye and entered another world. I looked down upon forests that covered enormous mountains as far as the eye could see. And in the distance, there was a river snaking its way down to a distant ocean with the evening sunlight shining upon it. I glanced towards the horizon and the landscape scrolled under my eyes until I found myself looking down at a turquoise sea covered in little jewel-like islands. And I could see tiny figures moving there down below. I squinted and we zoomed in. And I found myself looking at a fishing tribe there in canoes, diving down to gather pearls and lobsters. And I scrolled away to the other side of the world, across vast oceans, until I came to an enormous continent. It took me some time, but eventually I found a tribe who were hunting a giant wild mammoth. It took the whole tribe to bring it down with their spears whilst it swung at them with its long tusks. 2 of them died in the process. But eventually, they brought it down and ensured their families would have enough meat to eat for the next month. I watched the whole night through until the first of daylight's rays began to seep in the window and simultaneously the glass went dark. I couldn't wait to tell my friends at school about this. How jealous they would be. But then I remembered my promise that I'd made to the man in the market. And it occurred to me that if I was the only one who could see all those scenes inside the glass wall, then they would probably take me away to some funny doctor and put me on some pills. And if they could see it, then would they really leave such a treasure in the hands of a 10-year-old? No, it would be taken away to be studied by some scientist in a laboratory somewhere. The most I might expect would be a new bicycle in exchange. No. It was my secret, and so it would remain. Even if that meant I wouldn't get much sleep for a while. My parents were impressed by my New Year's resolution to go to bed early. And in truth, I couldn't wait for night to come. And I'd hurry up the stairs to my bedroom and go beneath the blankets and take out my glass ball and enter that other world. It was populated only by tribes who lived on the islands or vast continents or inside the jungle. And everything they had, from their clothes to their weapons to their tools, their food, all came from the animals they hunted. It was fascinating. I spent days upon weeks watching them. But even the most fascinating scenes grow old for a 10-year-old in the end. And leaning back one night, I thought nostalgically of the old snow globes that I used to find so enchanting. And on a sudden impulse, I gave it a shake. And it started to vibrate, and I dropped it, and the globe began to flash white and black in fast strobe-like succession. And when it finally calmed down, I nervously reached for it, and placing my eye inside, I found that now, whilst most people still lived in tribes, some of them had now settled down, and they'd built villages and towns, and big strange temples up to the sky where they sacrificed animals to make sure the sun would rise the next day. Now as I looked inside, I saw sailboats going up and down the coast with strange cargoes from exotic lands, delivering spices and textiles and slaves. to market towns, where there were robed men walking around discussing politics and philosophy. There were strange temples and churches rising up, and people wore amulets around their necks and markings on their forehead to denote which they followed. Walls had risen up around the city towns, patrolled by soldiers with arms of steel. I shook the globe again, and this time it was black. Black with crows flying as they swooped down on battlefields where there lay tens of thousands of people dead and dying. Smoke blew in from nearby towns which were burning in the trail of devastation and destruction that marauding armies left behind them. I scrolled across the world to the oceans where I saw ships crossing. And zooming in, I saw they were carrying human cargo. Thousands of slaves chained together by the neck, dying of disease and malnutrition, being carried across to a vast continent with plantations of cotton and sugar. I gave the globe an extra long shake this time, wanting to put those horrible scenes behind me. And now, as I looked in, it was once again black, but this time with satanic black smoke belched out of factories, where the workers slaved away in congested, crowded conditions, doing the same thing over and over. People died of disease in the streets, and carts came by to carry away the dead, with harsh metal wheels pulled along by horses, the horses that dominated the cities. Horse dung piled up everywhere, and rats running along the gutters quite unafraid. I saw steamships began to replace the sails, and railways crisscrossed the continents. Now I saw the first cars replacing the horses, and planes were making short journeys through the sky. Meanwhile, terrible, enormous wars were being fought, and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of men were crouched in trenches, dying of disease and war. Meanwhile, in the peaceful parts of the world, there was electric light, lighting up the houses and the cafes, and the rich wore eyeglasses as they read the books and newspapers, and there was always a radio playing. Telegraph wires crisscrossed the continents. Another shake, and this time the world started seeming more familiar to me. Cars drove everywhere now, and the streets were lit up by street lamps and neon signs. The houses also had their lights and the flickering neon of TV sets behind the curtains. Their occupants went out every morning to go and work in factories and offices. But in big squares in the main cities across the world, I could see rallies. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered, cheering the name of leaders dressed in army uniforms. And now, I saw planes flying across the sky in formation between the great continents, letting fall a cascade of bombs that set the world on fire, rising up in a mushroom cloud of smoke. The light was blinding, and I pulled back, wishing I'd never seen these cataclysmic scenes. I shook the globe again, but now, every time I looked in, all I saw was a lifeless landscape, bleak, desolate terrains covered in dust, and not a living thing to be seen anywhere. A while later, the light in the globe went out, it turned black, and it stayed that way. I think my childhood ended that night. I was still far from being grown up, of course, and for some years I wandered in a kind of limbo until I developed enough perspective to understand what I'd seen. We all need a point of view to make sense of things. What is a story, after all, but the perspective of the one telling it? But I was too young to have seen such scenes, and it made me grow old before my time. The following year, I announced to my parents that I wouldn't be celebrating Christmas anymore. I didn't believe in it. They were saddened by my bitterness, but respected my wishes and asked only that I spare the feelings of my grandmothers and accept the money they would send me in their Christmas cards with the garish reindeer and elves on the front. But when it came to New Year's Day, despite my protest, my parents insisted on dragging me along to the second-hand market. And I shuffled along in a quite different mood than the year before. You just couldn't wait, could you? A lifetime that could have lasted you. Instead it took, what, a week? Shaky, and it was all over. Well, I hope you enjoyed yourself, said the man who had sold me the glass dome the year before, looking down upon me with that racing newspaper under his arm. I'm sorry. I don't suppose you have another one? No. And if I did, I wouldn't waste it on the likes of you. Go along now. I shuffled away, but the question that had been burning on my mind rose to my lips, and I said, sorry, but all the time I was looking in. Could they see me? Well, it seems you're not a total idiot after all. No, laddie. For your peace of mind, they couldn't see you. Every time you looked in, you were just one more star in the sky, that's all. Who counts the stars in the sky each night, after all? Perspective. We all need it to make sense of our lives, but that day I learned that it's not just about who's looking out, but who might be looking in.